Twin black boys were denied boarding for having braids. The gate agent sneered, "You don't deserve first class." Seconds later, their father made one phone call. To the president. What happens next will leave you speechless. He sneered at two brothers, saying they didn't deserve a first-class seat because of their hair. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. Those braids don't belong in first class. The words landed like a slap in the air, sharp, ugly, and entirely out of place in the quiet efficiency of Gate 12B at Eastport International. The terminal buzzed with the usual hum of rolling suitcases, gate announcements, and half-hearted conversations. But for Khalil and Darius Winter, the world had narrowed to one man and his pointed glare. Victor Hearn, the tall, pale-skinned gate agent in a pressed Navy uniform, hadn't even looked at their tickets before speaking. His narrowed eyes scanned the twins from head to toe, pausing on their long, neatly parted braids. He wore a name badge that glinted beneath the fluorescent lights and a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Khalil felt a strange mix of confusion and fury begin to churn in his chest. He extended his boarding pass, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're on the 10:20 to Bryson City." First-class Victor didn't take the ticket. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice a low hiss meant only for them. "Black boys like you don't deserve those seats." Darius inhaled sharply beside him, shoulders tensing beneath his crisp gray travel jacket. Khalil stiffened, every instinct screaming to react, to say something, to do something. But he caught the slight turn of his brother's head, the whispered warning, "Let's stay calm." Behind them, a line had begun to form, passengers casually checking phones, adjusting carry-ons, unaware of the fire igniting at the front. Victor straightened and swiped his hand across the scanner, eyes never leaving theirs. The machine gave a dull beep, followed by a flashing red light. "Looks like your tickets aren't valid after all," he said, loud enough for others to hear. His tone was falsely chipper, soaked in mockery. "They were booked 2 months ago," Darius said evenly, his voice like tempered glass. "Paid in full." Victor shrugged. "Maybe there was a mix-up." "Happens all the time. You'll have to step aside." Khalil's fists clenched involuntarily. He felt the leather strap of his satchel dig into his palm as he tried to keep his anger from boiling over. Not here. Not like this. This wasn't some random delay. This was personal. The flight they were meant to board, seat 2A and 2B, right behind the cockpit, was slipping away not because of logistics, but because of something far more rotten. "You didn't even scan them," Khalil said quietly, but his voice carried. Victor's smirk wavered just for a second. More passengers were beginning to notice. A middle-aged man with a red scarf stepped out of line and glanced between the boys and the gate agent. A young boy behind him asked his father something about why those guys can't get on, but the father quickly hushed him. Victor's smile twisted. "You boys can either step aside or cause a scene." "Your choice." The tension was thick now, a heavy fog pressing into every breath. Darius stepped closer to his brother, eyes flicking left and right. "We should call him," he said under his breath. Khalil hesitated. "Are you sure?" "He told us this would happen one day," Darius replied, pulling his phone from his jacket. "Let's see what they do when they realize we're not just anybody." Khalil nodded slowly, jaw tight. Their father, Samuel Winter, had warned them of this, had trained them, in quiet moments over dinner or during long walks, for the day when the world would try to put them in a smaller box than they belonged in, not just because of their age, not just because of their skin, but because people like Victor existed behind desks with quiet authority and ugly hearts. Darius's hands trembled as he dialed. His thumb hovered for just a beat before pressing, "Call Dad." Victor, watching with amusement, sneered. "Call your father? What's he going to do? Buy you manners?" The line connected. "Dad?" Darius's voice cracked just slightly. "We need you." Right now, Khalil stood beside him like a statue, eyes burning into Victor. The man still looked amused, like this was a joke he'd seen before. But Khalil noticed a few passengers pulling out their phones, subtly recording, their faces flickering between curiosity and concern. "We're being denied boarding," Darius said into the phone. He said we don't belong here." A pause. "Yes, exactly like that." Khalil could hear the change in their father's voice through the speaker even though he couldn't make out the words. Calm, focused, dangerous in its stillness. "He said to stay here," Darius whispered, ending the call. Victor gave a long, theatrical sigh. If you're done with your little performance, there are paying customers waiting. That's when a second man appeared, a uniformed airport supervisor named Carl Bexley. Tall, gray hair, clipboard in hand. He took in the scene with a practiced glance. "What's going on here?" he asked, tone neutral. Victor gestured lazily. "They're causing a delay." Claimed they had first-class tickets. Didn't check out. Khalil stepped forward. "We have valid tickets." He never scanned them. He said. Carl raised a hand. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. But let's not make a fuss, all right? We have appearance standards and—" He didn't finish. The phrase hung there, heavy and offensive. Darius whispered, "Appearance standards?" Khalil stared at them both, something deep inside of him hardening. He looked around. Dozens of strangers now watched them. Some tried to look away. Some didn't bother. Khalil breathed through his nose, slow and controlled. "He'll regret every word," he muttered, just loud enough for Darius to hear. And somewhere outside the terminal, a luxury black SUV had just pulled into the airport's drop-off lane. The man stepping out was not just a father. He was the one man Victor Hearn would wish he'd never crossed. What started as a trip to a competition was becoming a battle for dignity. Darius's thumb trembled against the glass screen of his phone as he unlocked it, each second dragging like a weight on his chest. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, not from fear, but from a simmering disbelief that this was actually happening. A gate agent had just told him and his twin brother they didn't belong in first class because of their hair. His fingers stumbled as he scrolled to his father's number, but he pressed "call" without hesitation. Behind him, the line of passengers began to grow. Some were growing impatient, others curious, but no one yet fully understood the depth of what had just unfolded. Beside him, Khalil stood stiffly, eyes fixed on Victor Hearn, the gate attendant who had denied them boarding. Victor's expression was smug, his arms folded, posture relaxed like a man who believed he'd just performed a routine duty. Khalil's fists tightened at his sides, nails pressing into his palms. He was burning inside, burning with the weight of insult, the sting of dismissal. And yet, he didn't speak. Not yet. "Hello?" came the voice on the other end of the line. Calm, composed, with a gravity that could shift the tone of any conversation. "Dad," Darius said, voice low but steady. "They won't let us board." He said our braids don't belong in first class." There was silence for a beat. Then came Samuel Winter's response, measured, cold, like steel being drawn from its sheath. "Stay there," he said. "Say nothing more." Darius lowered the phone slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. Across from him, Victor raised an eyebrow, feigning amusement. "Call your father?" he scoffed, stepping forward just enough to lean in. His voice dropped to a whisper only the boys could hear. "What's he going to do? Buy you manners?" Khalil's jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. He took one sharp breath through his nose, stared directly into Victor's eyes, and said nothing. The air around them felt suddenly heavier, like the shift before a thunderstorm. People in the terminal were starting to notice. Conversations dimmed. The sound of rolling suitcases and flight announcements seemed to fade into the background. One man, seated nearby with a tablet in his lap, turned on his phone camera. A teenage boy nudged his father, whispering something as he pointed toward the gate. A young couple several feet away stared with concern. The gate printer beeped, then fell silent again. No tickets were being scanned. No boarding announcements followed. The gate had become a stage, and Victor, oblivious to the audience gathering, remained smug in his post. A few feet away, an attendant in a navy blue blazer whispered something into a handheld radio. Moments later, a uniformed airport supervisor appeared, briskly approaching the gate counter. He was a broad-shouldered man named Paul Linter, his face serious, his badge flashing as he arrived. "What seems to be the issue?" Linter asked, eyes flicking between Victor and the two boys. Victor straightened his tie and gestured toward them with a thumb. "They're claiming first class, but their appearance isn't aligned with standard boarding presentation. I denied them access." Linter's gaze paused on Khalil and Darius, then softened with something that looked almost like embarrassment, but not sympathy. "Appearance matters, boys," he said, addressing them with a firm, bureaucratic tone. "Premium boarding requires adherence to standards. This isn't about race." That word hadn't even been spoken until now. and the moment it entered the air, it hung there like a thundercloud. Darius blinked. Khalil exhaled a short laugh of disbelief. Khalil stepped forward, voice low. "You haven't even looked at our tickets." Linter gave a polite shrug. "The agent has discretion." "Discretion to deny us based on our hair?" Darius asked, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of restraint. Victor turned away from them, pretending to sort through papers on the desk. He couldn't even look at them anymore, but the damage was done. The crowd grew denser now. More phones were lifted, some subtly, others bold. Murmurs filled the space between announcements. People were connecting dots. Some began to recognize the boys, not by name, but by the presence they carried. They weren't just travelers anymore. They were a story unfolding in real time. From a nearby bench, an older man in a dark coat leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. He didn't say a word, but his phone was already recording. Back at the gate, Darius turned to his brother, voice tight. "He's coming." Khalil nodded, his stare still locked on Victor. "He'll regret every word." The words were whispered, but they carried enough weight to pull the attention of the nearest passengers. The line had stalled completely. Boarding was halted, and the gate, once a place of simple transactions, had become a fault line between power and prejudice, arrogance and accountability. Far across the terminal, past the blinking departure screens and scattered food courts, a man stepped through the security doors. His stride was purposeful, his coat immaculate, and his eyes fixed forward. He walked not with haste, but with the quiet force of someone who already knew the outcome. At gate 22A, the storm had only just begun. What they thought was two boys alone was about to become something far greater. When Samuel Winter stepped into the terminal, the air changed. He didn't pause, didn't look around, didn't need to. The tension in the room bent toward him like metal drawn to a magnet. Every step he took echoed with controlled precision, the sound of his polished shoes distinct against the marble floor. His frame was tall, his shoulders squared beneath a tailored navy overcoat, and his eyes, steady, intelligent, unblinking, moved only to find his son's. He walked past Victor Hearn and the supervisor like they were invisible, as though they were not even worthy of acknowledgement. Khalil and Darius stood still, faces strained but upright, their shoulders tense with the weight of humiliation. When Samuel reached them, he did not speak right away. He looked at each of them, placing a firm hand on Khalil's shoulder first, then on Darius's, grounding them. "What happened?" His voice was low, nearly a whisper, but edged with something sharper, something that made Darius straighten his spine and Khalil finally exhale. Khalil spoke quietly, his voice tight. He said, "Our hair didn't belong in first class. He never even scanned our tickets." Samuel said nothing at first. He merely turned. And now, for the first time, he looked directly at Victor. Victor straightened slightly, but not out of respect. He wore a smirk that curled up like a sneer. His arms crossed over his chest, clearly mistaking Samuel for just another angry parent. "They didn't meet appearance standards," Victor said quickly, a rehearsed line. "We have policies. Did you deny my son's boarding because of their hair?" Samuel's voice interrupted, flat and controlled, as if testing the structure of a fragile wall before deciding where to push. Victor blinked, taken off guard by the calmness. He gave a mocking shrug and nodded, eyes narrowing with false confidence. "I followed the airline's protocol." From the side, the supervisor, middle-aged, graying, visibly anxious, stepped in, eager to back up his co-worker. "It was a matter of appearance standards, sir." Nothing personal. Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers. More phones came up, quietly clicking into recording mode. The air grew thicker, the silence louder. Samuel tilted his head slightly, his gaze now on the supervisor. "Standards." That one word hung in the air like a blade. His tone had not risen, but its effect was immediate. The supervisor shifted uneasily, his eyes darting toward Victor as if silently asking for support. Victor's smirk faltered. Around them, passengers whispered. Someone said his name out loud. "That's Samuel Winter." It spread quickly. Another passenger repeated it, louder. Others nodded. Someone Googled him right there at the gate, then turned their phone screen around to show a photo, Samuel beside President Alden Roth at a press conference. Victor noticed. His expression twitched. Doubt crept into his posture, but he tried to hold his ground. Samuel pulled out his phone and made a single call. He spoke in hushed tones, but his jaw was firm, his brows locked. The call lasted seconds. Then he slid the phone back into his coat pocket as though he had just ordered coffee, not set a chain of consequences in motion. Moments later, the first ripple arrived. 2 uniformed security officers briskly entered the terminal from the adjacent hallway. Their movements were purposeful, and they didn't glance at Samuel. They walked straight toward Victor and the supervisor. "Mr. Hearn." "Mr. Carver," one of them said, nodding at both men. "Please come with us." Victor blinked. "What is this?" "I'm on duty." The second officer, a tall man with a commanding presence, replied without emotion. "You've been asked to step aside pending investigation." This is not a request passengers watched, stunned, as the 2 men were gently but firmly escorted away from the counter. Victor glanced over his shoulder, the color draining from his face. The arrogance had vanished. The supervisor followed without resistance, head lowered. Samuel remained still. He hadn't moved from his son's side. He didn't look triumphant, he looked focused. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were watching with full attention now, drawn into the unfolding scene like a courtroom drama. Some had begun live streaming, others simply stared in awe. Samuel turned slowly, placing a calm, protective hand on Darius's shoulder. His voice rose just loud enough for everyone to hear, but it was still steady and cold. "No one tells my sons they don't belong." No one. The terminal, for a full second, went utterly still, and then the truth of who he was settled into the room like thunder after lightning. The father they mocked was the president's right hand. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" The words hadn't even left Victor's mouth before the air around Gate 12 shifted like a storm front rolling in. A ripple of energy spread through the terminal. Subtle at first, a collective intake of breath, a stilling of footsteps, heads turning as whispers swept across the crowd like wind catching dry leaves. "That's Samuel Winter," someone said in a low, reverent voice. Another passenger, closer to the commotion, raised his phone higher and hit record. Within seconds, others followed. A dozen lenses captured the scene as if history itself were unfolding. Victor, who had been leaning against the gate counter with false confidence, straightened slowly. He looked around, sensing the shift, but his pride resisted retreat. He tried to smile, but it faltered under the weight of the stares. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot," he muttered, now gesturing weakly toward Samuel. "It's just airline policy, you understand." Samuel did not flinch. His stance remained firm, shoulders squared, posture impeccable, his sharp gray suit catching the overhead light like armor. He turned slightly to glance at his sons, Khalil and Darius, who stood quietly beside him, eyes still burning with the memory of what had been said. Then Samuel faced Victor fully. "You denied them boarding," he said calmly, his voice steady but edged with iron. "Not for behavior, not for security, but for their hair. You said, 'Black boys like you don't deserve those seats.' That was your language." Victor opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. The terminal had grown so quiet that even the soft beeps from the scanning machines sounded like alarms. "I didn't. That's not what I meant," Victor stammered, his face reddening. "It was a misunderstanding." Behind the counter, another staff member began slowly backing away toward the phone on the wall. Passengers leaned in, their faces lit by phone screens as they continued recording. The dramatic irony pressed down hard. Victor was still clinging to his lie, unaware that every second of his behavior had become a digital record, spreading beyond his control. "I want your flight manager here," Samuel said firmly, but without raising his voice. "Now." The staff member on the phone nodded quickly, muttering into the receiver. Victor's smirk was gone, replaced by sweat at his temple and a nervous twitch in his left eye. Moments later, a man in a dark navy blazer approached with hurried steps. His name badge read, Lionel Dresch, Regional Flight Operations Manager. He arrived with a forced smile and both hands raised in a calming gesture. "Mr. Winter, I understand there's been an incident," Lionel began smoothly. "Let me be the first to apologize for any confusion or discomfort." "We pride ourselves on," Samuel cut in, his tone slicing through the rehearsed words like glass through fabric. "This wasn't confusion. This was discrimination, dressed in protocol." Lionel's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept the smile in place. "I assure you, that is not how we train our team." "Then perhaps your training is as hollow as your apologies," Samuel replied. He turned toward the gathering crowd. This man, he gestured to Victor, told my sons they didn't belong in first class because of how they looked. Because of who they are. That is not a training issue. That is a systemic failure. Gasps echoed around them. The crowd thickened. The tension stretched like wire about to snap. Several passengers exchanged glances, murmuring his name. Is that the Samuel Winter? The one who works with the president? I've seen him on TV. Realization hit Lionel like a slap. His face paled as he leaned toward Victor and hissed, "Do you know who you just insulted?" Victor froze. The smugness drained out of him like ink from a broken pen. He looked around, panicked now, as if realizing the floor beneath him had vanished. "I didn't know," he mumbled. "I didn't know who they were." And if they weren't who they were, would it have been acceptable? Samuel asked sharply, turning back. Should dignity be earned by title, or should it be the starting point of service? Lionel opened his mouth, but no answer came. Then, from the side of the crowd, an older man stepped forward, his presence quiet but commanding. He wore a tan overcoat, thick glasses, and a calm expression that concealed an undercurrent of fire. "I was there," the man said. His voice was clear, carrying through the terminal with the weight of authority. "From the beginning." Lionel frowned. "Sir, this is a private." The man ignored him. "My name is Cyrus Cade," he said. "Retired circuit court judge. I saw and heard everything, and I recorded it." He raised his phone slowly, displaying the screen to show a video file already time-stamped and saved. A few gasps followed. "Discrimination of this kind," Cyrus continued, "is not just immoral. It is unlawful. I'll be forwarding this to the Civil Aviation Oversight Bureau myself." A cheer broke out among the passengers. Victor stumbled back, eyes wide. Lionel's hands dropped to his sides. The applause wasn't loud, but it was enough to signal that the tide had fully turned. Samuel remained silent for a long moment, then gave a small nod to Judge Cade. "You didn't have to step forward," Samuel said quietly. "Yes," the judge replied, lowering his phone, "but silence is a form of permission." Suddenly, Samuel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen and read the text. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. It was from a blocked number. The message was short. "They've done this before. You're not the first. Look deeper." Samuel slowly locked the screen, slid the phone back into his pocket, and looked past Lionel and Victor as if seeing something far beyond them. The crowd continued watching, still recording, still whispering. But Samuel's thoughts had moved elsewhere, into the shadows hinted at by the message. His calm exterior didn't flicker, but his purpose deepened. This was no longer about apologies or boarding passes. This was about pulling back the curtain, about asking who had written the rules that allowed his sons to be humiliated with a smile. The gate attendants thought they were ending a problem. They had no idea they had just awakened a reckoning. The insult to his sons was just the surface of a much darker foundation. The lounge door swung open with a soft hiss as Samuel Winter stepped inside, his sons close behind him. The space was quiet, dimly lit with golden overhead lights, and lined with sleek leather chairs that smelled faintly of cedar and polish. The calm air inside was a sharp contrast to the chaos and tension still simmering outside the terminal. An airport official hovered near the door, nervously clutching a tablet, eager to help but terrified of overstepping. Samuel barely acknowledged him. He moved with silent precision, like a man who had been here before. Perhaps not this exact room, but this kind of moment. A moment where calm was required, but war was inevitable. As the door clicked shut behind them, Khalil exhaled sharply and turned toward his father, fists clenched at his sides, jaw tight. "Why don't we just walk away now that they're scared?" His voice cracked slightly, not from fear, but from fury. His pride was still bleeding, raw and unbandaged. Samuel paused before answering, walking slowly to the window overlooking the runway. His reflection stared back at him, hardened and thoughtful. Then he turned to face his son, voice firm but steady. "Walking away gives them power. Exposing them takes it back." Khalil blinked, the fire in his eyes slowly receding into focused resolve. Darius said nothing, but his silence carried its own weight, measured, thoughtful, dangerous in a different way. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing with muscle memory. The number didn't need thought, it was engraved into him. 3 rings, then a voice answered. "Marcus," Samuel said, his tone low and direct. We're not dealing with one man's prejudice. Start digging. I want every recorded incident involving this airline and discriminatory behavior in the last 5 years. On the other end, Marcus Denholm, a seasoned aide in the Capitol with eyes in places few dared look, responded immediately. I'm on it. I'll have something for you in a few hours. Samuel ended the call and set the phone on the table with a quiet thud. He looked at both his sons. This was never about a seat on a plane. This is about who they think deserves to be seen, respected, and believed, and who they think doesn't. Outside the soundproof glass, planes rose and fell into the orange haze of evening light, but inside the room, a storm was forming. Meanwhile, the ripple of the incident was already spreading like wildfire. Passengers had posted the footage online, some clips already reaching thousands of views within minutes. The video showed Victor's sneering face, the rejection of the twins' tickets. The exact words hissed in low tones but picked up clearly. Black boys, like you don't deserve those seats, social media exploded. Comments poured in, some shocked, others furious. A few tried to downplay the incident, calling it a misunderstanding. But the footage didn't lie. It was clear, it was cruel, and it was real. Back in the lounge, Samuel's phone buzzed again. He picked it up without hesitation. Samuel, Marcus said quickly, voice tighter now. There's more. A man inside the airline just contacted me. Name's Elias Ward, low-level scheduling officer. He says this isn't isolated. He claims the discrimination is directed, strategic. Not every black or minority passenger, but ones with visibility, influence, people they think might cause trouble for the brand. Samuel's jaw tightened. They have a system? He asked slowly, as if testing the words. Unofficial, nothing written, but consistent. He's willing to talk, under protection. Samuel closed his eyes for a second, then reopened them with renewed fire. Then we protect him. Whatever it takes. He ended the call and sat down for the first time since entering the room. The leather chair creaked under the tension in his shoulders. Across from him, Khalil leaned forward. What does that mean? He asked. Directed discrimination. Samuel looked his sons in the eyes. It means they're targeting people like us, who speak, who represent, who don't fit their image of premium. It's about money, control. Silence. Darius leaned back in his chair, fists clenched. They want people like us out of sight. And out of voice, Samuel added. A knock sounded at the door. The official re-entered with a trembling hand holding a printed statement from the airline. Samuel took it, scanning the page quickly. A bland apology. Miscommunication. Regret. Internal review. He handed it back with no expression. Release that, and you'll only make it worse, he said flatly. The official hesitated. But sir, this is protocol. Samuel stood, and his presence filled the room. Protocol, he repeated, was what got us here. The man nodded and backed out, leaving them alone again. The silence settled like dust. Samuel turned to the window once more, watching as another plane took off, its nose lifting above the clouds. He knew this battle would not end in an airport lounge. The truth was layered, buried beneath public smiles and corporate policy. But now the first layer had been peeled away, and beneath it was something colder, sharper, strategic. Samuel looked back at his sons, both now sitting straighter, their eyes locked on his. This is not just our fight anymore, he told them, voice heavy with purpose. He realized the coming battle would shake more than one airline. What began as humiliation at a gate was becoming a war against hidden prejudice. Elias's message arrived just after dawn. Samuel Winters stared at the screen, the words glowing cold and sharp. They know I talked. He didn't move. The study was quiet, the only sound the faint tapping of rain against the tall window panes. Across the desk, Khalil and Darius sat tense and alert, watching their father's expression harden. The papers in front of them, internal reports, printouts of anonymous complaints, time-stamped video stills, felt suddenly heavier, as if the truth they contained had shifted from burden to weapon. Samuel looked up slowly, his jaw clenched. It's begun, he said, his voice low but firm. Khalil leaned forward, brow furrowed. What does he mean? Who knows? Everyone who shouldn't, Samuel replied, standing. He paced to the window, hands behind his back, eyes following a slow-moving car below. The airline. They're bored, maybe even others we haven't seen yet. Darius set down a stack of printed passenger complaints. So, what do? We have enough. We go public. Samuel turned sharply, his tone clipped. No, not yet. But why? Khalil asked, frustration slipping through his voice. We have the memos, the footage. If they're going after Elias, we can't wait. And if we speak too soon, Samuel interrupted, walking back to the desk. They bury him. They erase everything. They call it hearsay. They turn us into the story and make them look like the victims of a smear campaign. Khalil sat back, silent, the fire in his eyes smoldering beneath the surface. Samuel saw it, righteous anger, the ache of being dismissed, denied, insulted in public, and felt it mirror his own. But anger alone would not win this fight. Strategy would. He tapped the desk. Every insult hides a pattern. Find the pattern, and you crush the lie his sons listened. The weight of the mission settled over them like armor. Samuel turned to Darius. Start building a timeline. Every clip, every post, every comment uploaded from that terminal. I want to see the full arc, what people saw, what they said, and when. Darius nodded, already powering up his laptop. On it. Khalil, Samuel continued, placing a thick folder in front of him. These are the airline's government travel contracts. Study them. Look for gaps, clauses, anything that ties our case to public funding. If we can prove they used federal money to discriminate, the damage goes beyond headlines. Khalil opened the folder, the pages crinkling beneath his fingers. We'll bury them in their own rules. Pride flickered across Samuel's face, but only briefly. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus Denholm. Talk to me, Samuel answered, walking toward the hallway to take the call in private. Back in the study, Darius sifted through a massive trove of online clips. He dragged markers along a timeline, syncing every known upload from the airport terminal into one long narrative. The videos, when viewed in isolation, were powerful. But together, they told a full story, a story no airline executive could easily deny. Khalil, meanwhile, sank into the thick legalese of federal travel codes. He flagged a line in one contract that described passenger appearance standards for executive travel. The wording was vague, too vague. He highlighted it and scrawled a note in the margin, potential for misuse. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When Samuel returned, he looked more guarded than before. They're accelerating, he said without preamble. Marcus just confirmed surveillance near Elias's apartment. 2 men, unmarked car. Plainclothes, but trained Darius sat up straighter. Like law enforcement? Could be. Could be hired security. Either way, Elias is no longer safe. Samuel exhaled slowly. We have to assume they'll come for us next. The room chilled. Outside, thunder rumbled across the sky. Samuel laid a fresh set of documents on the desk. These are clearance forms. I want you both on backup data drives. No cloud, no email. If something happens to me... No, Khalil said quickly. Don't say that. You need to be prepared, Samuel replied, his voice steady but not cold. We're not just dealing with prejudice anymore. We're dealing with people who profit from it, people who fear exposure more than law. Darius's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a new external drive. Do you think Elias will be okay? Samuel didn't answer right away. His silence spoke more than words. He turned his gaze toward the window again, rain streaking down the glass like thin trails of ink. They know I talked, he repeated quietly. That message wasn't just a warning. It was a line being drawn. Foreshadowing stirred in the air. Somewhere in the distance, sirens echoed faintly before fading, and as Samuel sat back down, his voice carried the weight of steel. The battle Samuel sought in court was already being fought in the shadows. Samuel Winter stepped through the narrow door of the cafe, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the cracked tile floor. The scent of burnt espresso clung to the air, and the buzz of an old refrigerator hummed behind the counter. In a back corner, half hidden behind a chipped pillar, sat Elias Ward, his fingers wrapped tightly around a chipped mug, steam curling above it though he hadn't touched the drink. His eyes, tired and jittery, scanned every person who entered, flinching at the jingle of the door. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Samuel slid into the seat across from him without a word. No handshake, no greeting, just a measured look that conveyed both trust and urgency. Elias reached into his coat, then paused, eyes darting to the windows. They followed me yesterday, he whispered. 3 blocks. Same car. They didn't even bother hiding it. Samuel's gaze remained steady. You said you had something. Do you still have it? With a trembling hand, Elias slid a small black flash drive across the table. It landed with a soft click on the wood. They call it selective courtesy, Elias said, voice low. But that's just the nickname. The real name is Directive 91B. It's not written in policy manuals, just passed down through supervisor briefings and internal emails. The rule is simple. If the passenger doesn't match visual brand expectations, delay them, downgrade them, find a reason to make them leave the seat. Samuel picked up the drive, turning it slowly between his fingers. Visual brand expectations, he repeated, each word heavier than the last. Elias leaned in, eyes flickering. It's not just racism, it's economics. First-class tickets, when resold last minute, can go for triple the price, so they target passengers they think won't fight back or that they think won't be missed. The words settled like ice in Samuel's chest. His mind raced, not with anger, but with clarity. This wasn't just prejudice. It was profit-driven discrimination, weaponized under the veil of professionalism. He had thought he was fighting a single incident. Now he realized he was staring into the machinery of a much darker design. I can't go to court, Elias said suddenly, voice breaking. They've already threatened my family. Someone left an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a photo of my daughter walking to school. Samuel's eyes narrowed. They threatened a child. Elias nodded. I've backed up everything on that drive. If something happens to me, it's set to upload to 3 different newsrooms, but that doesn't protect my family. Samuel exhaled slowly. I'll see to it that you're protected. But we need to bring this to light. Carefully. Precisely. The cafe door opened again with a soft chime, and both men instinctively looked up. A delivery driver stepped in, muttering to the barista. Elias relaxed slightly, but the tension in his shoulders never fully left. Samuel checked the time. I'm preparing a press conference. We'll hit them with this at the right moment. Once it's public, it'll be harder for them to bury it. Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. Be careful. This goes deeper than you think. You pull too hard on the wrong string, and the whole roof might fall. Samuel stood, pocketing the flash drive. Then, let's make sure it lands on the right heads. Outside, the city's air was cool and overcast, the streets damp from a recent drizzle. Samuel tightened his coat and stepped off the curb, heading toward his car parked just around the corner. As he turned the corner, footsteps approached from the opposite side. 2 men emerged from the alleyway, tall, well-dressed, with clean-shaven faces and no visible IDs. Their coats were unmarked, their movements precise. One raised a hand casually, not blocking Samuel's path but making it clear he should stop. Mr. Winter, the man on the left said, his voice smooth but firm. You've been asking questions. Samuel didn't break stride. I ask questions every day. It's my job. The second man stepped closer. Then here's an answer. Drop this, Mr. Winter. There are contracts bigger than you know. Samuel paused, his eyes locking onto theirs. There was no threat in their posture, no aggression. That made it worse. This wasn't intimidation. It was a warning from people who assumed their power would be obeyed without resistance. I appreciate the concern, he said evenly, but I've never been good at ignoring the truth. The men didn't reply. They stepped aside, letting him pass. But the message had been delivered. Inside his car, Samuel gripped the wheel in silence. His sons' faces flashed through his mind, not just from the terminal, but from years of teaching them to stand tall, to speak clearly, to never flinch when facing injustice. They had been humiliated for their appearance, but that pain had exposed a hidden engine of cruelty. And now, that truth had placed a target on his back. He stared at the flash drive in the passenger seat, the weight of it far greater than its size. The battle had escalated. This was no longer about an airline. This was about an entire structure built on quiet exclusion. As the engine started and the city's noise faded behind him, Samuel Winter knew the next steps would require more than strategy. They would require resolve, sharper than fear. Because the empire he now faced wasn't built by accident. The truth Samuel carried was dangerous enough to shake the corridors of power. He thought humiliating black twins at the gate would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe dignity must always be defended, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Back home, the silence in the Winter household felt heavier than the echoing terminal they had left behind. The living room sat in soft shadows, blinds partially drawn, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Samuel paced near the fireplace, his phone clenched tightly in his hand. He had returned from his confrontation at the airport only hours earlier, and though his sons had been allowed into the private lounge under quiet apologies, the insult hadn't been erased, it had only deepened. He hadn't told them everything. Not about the two men in dark coats, not about the warning they whispered, not about the contracts they hinted were untouchable. Khalil sat on the edge of the couch, elbow on his knee, chin resting on a clenched fist. Darius leaned against the wall by the window, staring out at the still street beyond. Both boys carried the weight of humiliation beneath their polished exteriors. To the world, they were students headed to an academic competition. But inside, something had shifted. They were no longer simply travelers. They were witnesses to something cruel, something many had ignored for too long. "He's not telling us everything," Khalil said, his voice low but steady. Darius didn't look away from the window. "He's trying to protect us." "I don't want protection. I want truth." Khalil's voice cracked slightly as he stood. "If we don't speak, who will?" Their father had told them to stay quiet for now, that things were moving, that silence for the moment was strategic, but silence was also what allowed injustice to hide. They waited until Samuel left the room, retreating to his study to take another secure call with Marcus. Then, quietly but with resolve, the twins gathered their thoughts and set up a camera on the kitchen counter. The overhead light buzzed faintly. They didn't script anything. No fancy angles, just raw truth. Khalil looked into the lens first, his jaw tense. "We didn't think this would happen to us. But it did. A gate agent looked at our skin and our braids and decided we didn't belong." Darius followed. "He said we weren't right for first class. He told us, word for word, that black boys like us didn't deserve those seats. My brother and I, our tickets were valid. We were respectful, and we were still denied." They took turns, their voices steady, their faces serious. They didn't cry, though emotion brimmed at the edges. The video lasted only 2.5 minutes. No music, no effects, just their truth, raw and undiluted. They posted it online. By the time Samuel returned to the living room, the video had already gained thousands of views. 10 minutes later, it was trending. By midnight, major journalists were reaching out for interviews. The brothers had gone viral, and their faces were suddenly everywhere. News segments, retweets, screen captures, commentary videos. Some called them brave. Some accused them of exaggerating. But everyone was watching. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching his sons sit side by side on the couch, refreshing the feed on their phones, their faces lit by the pale glow of the screens. His heart ached with pride and dread. "You two," he began, his voice firm but quiet, "have just painted a target on yourselves." Khalil looked up. "We had to. You said this was bigger than us. We're just making sure people know." Samuel rubbed his brow, a tired breath escaping him. "You don't understand the kinds of people who benefit from keeping these things quiet. They don't just fight in court, they erase." But the momentum had already shifted. It was out there now. It couldn't be pulled back. Later that night, while Samuel reviewed reports in his study, Darius stood at the kitchen sink, drinking a glass of water when he noticed a car parked across the street. The headlights were off, the engine barely audible. A man sat in the driver's seat, not moving, just watching. Darius quietly backed away, the water glass still in his hand. He called for his father. Samuel moved fast. When he looked through the blinds, he didn't speak. He simply reached for his phone. The call to Marcus was short. Code words, brisk orders, precautions, surveillance. Shadows were moving faster now, and Samuel knew they couldn't wait much longer. The next morning, Samuel convened a private meeting in the dining room with his sons. He pulled out a large folder filled with printouts, internal emails, and documents from Elias. Some pages were marked with red ink, others with notes in the margins. "I was waiting to do this carefully," he said, looking at both boys. "But things have escalated. We can't rely on private investigations anymore. We go public." He outlined his plan. A live-streamed hearing, hosted in a neutral venue. Testimonies from passengers. Whistleblower documents, timelines, footage, everything collected, verified, and laid bare for the public to see. Once broadcast, it couldn't be buried, couldn't be spun. But we need to move fast, Samuel warned, because the people we're challenging, they're not used to being seen. He wasn't wrong. That afternoon, without warning, Lionel Dresch appeared on national television. The airline's polished manager, seated comfortably in front of a row of journalists, addressed the now viral video with smooth rehearsed charm. "I want to be clear," Lionel began, hands folded on the table, voice warm but hollow. "The young men in question were never denied based on race. Unfortunately, there's been a misrepresentation of events. We believe this was a coordinated attempt to generate attention using false accusations." Samuel stared at the screen in disbelief. The lie was bold, direct, and dangerous. "He's painting us as liars," Khalil whispered, standing behind the couch, fists clenched. Darius looked to his father. "What do we do?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "We make sure the world sees the truth. All of it." He turned off the TV. The image of Lionel's smug face disappeared in silence. The boys had spoken their truth. Now the system was fighting back with everything it had. Samuel's plan was no longer a suggestion, it was a necessity. The hearing would happen, and the next move would be theirs. The twins' pain was now a weapon, but their enemy had sharpened its own blade. The moment the false witness stood up, the air in the civic hall turned electric. He adjusted his crisp navy blazer, cleared his throat, and faced the crowd with a calculated calm. "My name is Aaron Kellner," he began, his voice polished like someone trained for press conferences, not truth-telling. "I was seated 3 rows behind the 2 young men in question during the flight. What I witnessed was troubling. They were loud, disruptive, and dismissive of crew instructions. At one point, one of them even mocked the flight attendant to entertain other passengers." A sharp murmur passed through the audience. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances. Some scribbled faster, while others lifted their cameras for tighter shots. In the second row, Darius flinched visibly, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. Khalil leaned forward, his jaw tight, the muscles in his cheek twitching. Their father, Samuel Winter, didn't react immediately. His eyes locked on the man with a stare that could cut through steel. Samuel's voice was low but firm as he leaned toward Marcus, his aide seated beside him. "That man is not a passenger," he said. "He's one of Lionel's spin doctors." Marcus nodded grimly. "Confirmed. He was at Aristominion's last PR summit. He's their crisis response consultant." Samuel turned his attention back to the stage. Aaron Kellner continued his testimony, his tone shifting just slightly into arrogance. "I understand the need for accountability, but the crew acted reasonably under the circumstances. I believe the airline was within its rights to maintain decorum in first class." The lie struck like a slap across the face. Darius whispered, "He's rewriting history." He wasn't even there. Samuel raised a hand gently, signaling them to hold steady. The room was a mix of stunned silence and mounting confusion. The judge glanced at Samuel, then at the witness, unsure whether to intervene. Even some members of the press seemed unsure what to believe now. The crowd had come expecting justice. Now they were being fed a fabrication wrapped in expensive cologne and polished shoes. "Do you have any supporting evidence for your claim?" the judge asked, lifting an eyebrow. Aaron smiled smoothly. "Just my word, sir. I don't record strangers for fun." The room shifted again, from disbelief to suspicion. The contradiction was subtle but growing. Samuel rose slowly, not needing permission to stand. His voice echoed calmly. "Your Honor, may I respond with evidence that predates Mr. Kellner's claims?" The judge nodded, sensing the mounting tension. "Proceed." Samuel turned, not to the court, but to the audience. "On the day my sons were denied boarding, many of you saw the footage shared online. But one man here recorded more than just a snippet. He captured the full truth. Mr. Cade, if you would, all heads turned." From the rear row, Cyrus Cade stood. Tall, dignified, and composed, the retired judge walked to the front with a quiet authority that silenced even the cameras. He held up his phone. "I'm not one for social media," he said, voice steady, "but I know injustice when I see it." And I knew that day would need proof. He tapped the screen. A moment later, the sound of the terminal echoed through the speakers. There it was, Victor Hearn's voice, clear and venomous. "Black boys like you don't deserve those seats." Gasps erupted. The courtroom came alive in a storm of emotion, shocked expressions, murmured outrage, hands flying to mouths. Darius's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Khalil stared straight ahead, eyes locked on the screen, watching the lie unravel. The judge looked down, brow furrowed, then turned his attention to Aaron. "Mr. Kellner, care to explain this discrepancy?" Aaron fumbled for words, but Lionel Dresch, seated near the back with folded arms, didn't flinch. His lips curled into a cold, calculated smile. It was a look Samuel recognized too well, the smile of a man with backup plans buried behind layers of deception. Samuel caught it, and his stomach turned. They had just shattered one lie, but Lionel wasn't panicked. He was patient. That smile meant something was waiting, something worse. The victory was real, but the war wasn't over. As the crowd broke into whispers and reporters rushed to update headlines, Samuel leaned toward Marcus once more. "He's got another card," he said quietly. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Then we find it before he plays it." Back on the stand, Aaron was excused, his story discredited, his exit swift and silent. Cyrus returned to his seat, greeted with grateful nods from strangers. The judge called for a recess. The hearing was paused, but no one left their seats. Everyone knew they were watching more than a legal battle. It had become a reckoning. The twins remained seated, quiet now, but stronger. For the first time in hours, the crowd looked at them not with doubt, but with belief. Yet Lionel sat still, fingers steepled, his eyes scanning the room with the eerie calm of a man who saw beyond the present. And Samuel knew. The battle wasn't over. It was only moving into its fiercest stage. With Cyrus's footage playing across the courtroom monitors, the silence was absolute. Every seat was filled, every eye locked on the screen. The voice captured in the video was Victor Hearn's, unfiltered, arrogant, and unmistakable. His words, "Black boys like you don't deserve those seats," cut through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the spectators. A few reporters dropped their pens. Samuel Winter sat still, hands folded in front of him, his expression calm but burning beneath the surface. Khalil and Darius, seated beside him, stared forward, emotion tightening in their throats. What had started as humiliation had now become evidence. But even as the tide turned, a smirk played at the corner of Lionel Dresch's mouth. He rose from his seat slowly, adjusted his cufflinks, and turned to the judge with a polished bow. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth and composed, "if I may, there's been a grave misunderstanding. You see, this case has never been about one man or one moment. What Mr. Winter believes he's exposing is nothing more than a ripple on the surface." The judge raised a brow, clearly unimpressed, but allowed him to continue. Lionel turned to the audience now, his words aimed as much at the cameras as the people. "You think you're fighting an airline," he said, eyes narrowing as he stared directly at Samuel, "but you're clawing at the walls of an empire." A low murmur spread across the room like wind before a storm. Samuel's eyes narrowed. That phrase, an empire, wasn't metaphorical. It was a warning. Outside the courtroom, the press erupted with theories. Inside, Samuel felt the weight of a darker revelation settling over him. Heiress Dominion. The name had surfaced once in a buried contract during Marcus's early research, but now it was no longer a background detail. It was the machine behind the mask, a multinational conglomerate with roots dug deep into federal aviation contracts, luxury charters, and even overseas diplomatic transport. Heiress Dominion wasn't just a business. It was a network. Back in his private office later that evening, Samuel stood at the window looking down at the city as rain traced streaks down the glass. He didn't speak for a long time. Marcus stood nearby, files in hand, watching his mentor's reflection. "They're bigger than we thought," Marcus finally said, voice low. "Heiress Dominion doesn't just own the airline. They control the logistics behind dozens of government travel accounts, Pentagon, Treasury, even diplomatic envoy routes." Samuel turned, his voice a quiet rumble. "Then this isn't about race to them. It's about power, control, optics, and profit," Marcus added. "The memo from Elias, the one about downgrading passengers who didn't match the brand, that wasn't just discrimination. It was a sales strategy. They resell those seats last minute for more. We're dealing with targeted exclusion and fraud." Samuel clenched his jaw. "Not anymore. He moved toward his desk and opened the secure case where several files had been kept under lock. He removed a set of documents and handed them to Marcus. Prepare submissions to the House Transportation Committee and the Inspector General's office. Include every incident, every internal memo, and highlight every contract clause that connects Heiress Dominion to federal spending. Marcus nodded but hesitated. And the marshals, sir? They warned us already. Samuel met his eyes. If they come again, they won't be leaving with a warning. The next few days blurred into tense motion. Legal teams were expanded. Analysts reviewed every detail. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the pressure on the Winter family grew. At school, Khalil noticed classmates going quiet when he entered the room. Darius was pulled aside by a teacher who warned, "You're becoming a distraction." Some parents are concerned one evening. While walking home, the brothers realized they were being followed. A black sedan trailed slowly behind them through 3 different blocks before disappearing into an alley. When they told Samuel, his reaction was immediate. He doubled their private security and had cameras installed across the property. But the message was clear. Someone was watching. Still, the twins refused to step back. In an interview with a student journalist at their school, Darius spoke firmly. "If they silence us, they silence every boy who's been told he doesn't belong." That quote spread across social media, painted on protest signs, echoed by activists. But with every gain came new danger. A local newspaper ran a counter-narrative op-ed, unsigned, questioning the boys' motives, calling them tools of a media circus. Samuel recognized the strategy. It was the same tactic used to discredit whistleblowers, raise doubt, fracture support. But Samuel was already thinking ahead. In the war room set up in the family's basement, maps and flowcharts lined the walls. Red string connected contract names to board members, to shell companies, to Heiress Dominion's inner circle. The task was clear. Prove that what happened at the gate wasn't an isolated insult, it was policy, and policy dictated by profit and prejudice at the highest level. "We'll need to move fast," Marcus said during one late-night briefing. "If we don't hit them with coordinated pressure from multiple fronts, legal, media, and political, they'll bury us in countersuits." Samuel nodded. "Then we pressure all 3 at once." In the final moments of that night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Samuel sat alone at the long oak table, reviewing a worn photograph of his sons as children, smiling, carefree, unaware of the battles life would bring them. He set the photo down slowly, then whispered to the empty room, more promise than prayer. What began with Braids at a gate would end with the collapse of an empire. The news came without warning. Victor Hearn had vanished. It was Marcus who stormed into Samuel's office with the update, his laptop open, his face unusually pale. "Sir," he said out of breath, "he's gone." Victor, the gate attendant. No contact, no trace. Samuel looked up slowly from the document he was annotating. "Gone?" "His apartment was emptied overnight," Marcus replied. "Neighbors say 2 men in uniforms, no badges, came with a van. Took everything. No explanation. His phone's been disconnected. His employee login wiped. It's like he never existed." For a moment, silence hung in the room, thick as storm clouds. Outside, the skyline of Bryson City gleamed under the morning sun. But inside Samuel's study, a chill settled. "They're cleaning the trail," Samuel muttered, leaning back in his chair. His thoughts raced. Victor was never the center of the machine. He was a lever, a trigger. But now, even the trigger had been pulled from the crime scene. The question is why now? As if in answer, Marcus turned the screen toward him. A single email flickered on the display. Encrypted. The sender was familiar. Elias Ward. Samuel's pulse quickened. They hadn't heard from Elias in weeks. They'd assumed the young scheduling officer had been forced into hiding, or worse. But here he was, alive, still watching. The message was brief. "Look higher. The boardroom has deals you cannot imagine." Samuel read it twice. His eyes narrowed. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out. "It's not just about racism," he said quietly. "It's economics. Influence. Survival. They're protecting more than policy. They're guarding profit pipelines tied to prejudice." "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, voice low, aware that this moment could change everything. "We aim higher," Samuel replied. "We take the fight into the upper chambers, into the core." The legal war had already begun days earlier. 3 boxes of filings, each stamped with the Winter name, had arrived at the federal courthouse like a declaration of war. Within them were demands for damages, requests for a federal inquiry, and detailed summaries of Heiress Dominion's discriminatory practices, tied tightly with evidence pulled from Elias's documents. Khalil and Darius had returned to the courtroom standing before cameras and microphones, testifying with quiet dignity. Their words, unrehearsed, raw, pierced the heart of every listener. "We were told we didn't belong," Khalil had said, "because we didn't look like first class." But dignity isn't a seat, it's a right. The courtroom had fallen silent after that. Yet as momentum gathered, the Victor news pulled them into darker waters. Something was shifting behind the curtain. Later that afternoon, Samuel met with Marcus again, this time inside the war room, a converted conference space covered in whiteboards and pinned documents. Strings connected photos, contracts, names. At the center, Heiress Dominion's executive board. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a folder labeled Phoenix Charters, a government luxury travel program. Heiress Dominion owns the subsidiary. They fly senators, federal judges, high-level staff, and this clause, he tapped a highlighted section, allows them to decline or downgrade passengers based on service protocol alignment. That's corporate speak for profiling, Samuel frowned. And the profit? 10 times standard rate, especially on short notice changes. If they downgrade someone, they resell the seat last minute, often to federal accounts. Samuel rubbed his chin slowly. That's not just discrimination. That's fraud. He felt the pressure building now, not just from outside forces but from within. Every step forward risked crushing someone. Elias, still missing. Leonard Voss, the executive who had started leaking secrets, was now under financial assault, his accounts frozen, his properties under audit. Even Marcus had noticed a strange car following him 2 nights in a row. They were being watched. And still, they pushed. "Should we pull back?" Marcus asked quietly. Samuel didn't answer right away. He walked to the wall where his son's photo hung, a shot of them from last summer in front of the Capitol steps, laughing, heads tilted back, fearless. "No," he finally said. "If we stop now, they win. And if Victor vanished to protect this empire, then we owe it to him too, even if he was part of it." That evening, as the courthouse lights dimmed and reporters packed up for the night, Samuel stood outside the courthouse steps, facing the press alone. He didn't speak in sound bites. He didn't offer rage, just clarity. "This isn't just about 2 boys. Or 1 flight, or 1 man with a grudge," he said. "This is about a system that sold seats to silence. That profited from the pain of people it deemed unworthy." A pause. "And I promise you, we're not done." Later, back in the quiet of his home, he sat once more with Marcus. The latest email from Elias replayed in his mind. "Look higher." He whispered it again to himself, and then, like iron drawn to fire, the words that burned through his thoughts rose aloud, steady, and absolute. Justice was no longer a goal. It had become a destiny. The gavel struck lightly against the bench, and the courtroom settled into silence as Leonard Voss took the stand. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw clenched tight, and though he tried to mask it, his eyes flickered nervously toward the gallery. Samuel Winter leaned forward at the counsel's table, studying the man closely. This was not an ordinary witness. This was a former executive of Heiress Dominion, someone who had once stood firmly behind the empire they now fought to dismantle. The audience could sense the gravity of the moment, reporters poised with pens hovering, cameras flashing silently. Every ear strained as the oath was spoken, and then Leonard's voice, low at first, broke the stillness. "I was present," Leonard admitted, his hands twisting against each other, when directives were issued by Lionel Dresch and members of the board. They were not written openly, but they were circulated in coded language. Attendants were told to maintain the brand's image by quietly excluding certain passengers. Those passengers, more often than not, were identified by race and social status. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. The words echoed like a thunderclap, undeniable and raw. Samuel saw Khalil stiffen beside him, his young face burning with both anger and validation. Darius lowered his gaze, lips pressed together, fighting to keep composure in front of so many eyes. The judge leaned forward, brows furrowed, and the defense team shuffled uneasily, whispering frantically among themselves. Leonard continued, each word heavier than the last. It was not an accident. It was not one rogue attendant. It was policy, unspoken but understood. Those who questioned it were dismissed or pushed out. His voice wavered then, emotion cracking through his careful composure. I resigned when I realized what I had become a part of, but silence does not erase guilt. And today I will not remain silent. The courtroom trembled with the weight of his confession. Yet even as murmurs swelled, danger shadowed the victory. Samuel's sharp eyes caught the flicker of hostility in the faces of Aristominion's lawyers. He knew what this testimony meant. It was not just a crack in their defense. It was a fracture that could bring the whole structure crashing down. And in that knowledge lay risk. By the afternoon recess, the cost of Leonard's courage was already visible. Outside the courthouse, Samuel spotted his shaken figure surrounded by reporters, only to see a stone hurled from the crowd, shattering against the pavement near his feet. Later, whispers spread that Leonard's family had been threatened, his car vandalized, his financial accounts frozen overnight. Samuel felt his stomach twist with anger. Aristominion was not merely defending itself. It was lashing out like a cornered beast, striking at anyone who dared defect. Inside, however, the mood shifted toward Samuel's sons. Khalil and Darius became symbols without trying. Their composed presence, their unwavering voices when questioned by the press, turned them into something more than plaintiffs. They were emblems of defiance. Cameras lingered on them as they walked hand in hand with their father, their braids worn proudly, their silence carrying weight. Yet Samuel saw the truth that others did not. Behind closed doors, the boys carried a burden far heavier than their years. At school, classmates kept their distance. Teachers, though polite, warned them to stay quiet, to avoid drawing more attention. Even their closest friends confessed fears of being targeted, simply for standing near them. At night, Samuel would find Darius staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight, or Khalil pacing the study with restless energy. They were celebrated publicly, but isolated privately. The irony was cruel, yet Samuel reminded himself that history often demanded sacrifice from the young. One evening, as they prepared for another day in court, Samuel overheard two men in sharp suits near the courthouse steps. Their voices were low, but Samuel caught enough. "They won't push this further. We'll bury it with settlements before it reaches the top." The words struck him harder than any blow. The executives had no intention of facing justice. They would try to smother the case under the weight of money and secrecy. The prophecy fulfilled itself the following week. In the middle of proceedings, Aristominion's lead counsel stood, his tone rehearsed, his expression almost smug. He announced the airline's offer. A settlement so staggering it silenced even the most skeptical. Wealth enough to secure generations, formal apologies written in polished ink, lifetime upgrades to private suites on every flight. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief. For many, it seemed an easy end, a comfortable escape from the storm. Darius's eyes turned immediately to his father. The boy's faith was unwavering. He knew Samuel's answer before a word was spoken. But Khalil, leaning close, whispered with quiet fire, "If we take it, nothing changes." His words carried the echo of everything they had endured, the humiliation at the gate, the whispers at school, the courage it had taken to sit in that courtroom day after day. Samuel looked at his sons, pride swelling, and nodded slowly. He rose to his feet, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber. "We are not here for comfort. We are here for change." The declaration rolled through the courtroom, sinking into every ear. Gasps turned into murmurs, and murmurs into rising applause that no gavel could silence. The refusal was not just a rejection of wealth, it was a declaration of war. Aristominion now faced an enemy it could not bribe away. The stakes had risen beyond compromise. Samuel could feel the walls of the empire beginning to tremble. His sons stood taller beside him, their resolve matched to his own. And though he knew the path ahead would only grow darker, there was no turning back. The twins chose legacy over luxury, and the empire trembled. The courtroom gasped as the audio played, Lionel Dresch's voice crisp and cold through the speakers. "Keep the brand clean," it commanded, followed by the chilling explanation of how attendants were to delay or downgrade passengers based on coded appearance categories. Every word echoed in the chamber, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls, and each syllable tightened the jaws of the jurors and widened the eyes of the reporters scribbling furiously. Samuel Winter sat motionless, his hands folded neatly on the polished table before him, but his chest felt heavy. He had waited weeks for this moment, the reveal of the evidence Elias Ward had risked everything to collect. At last, the truth was no longer whispers in dark corners, it was a voice carried by speakers for the world to hear. Across the aisle, Lionel's expression twisted. His fingers tapped nervously on the arm of his chair, and his lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Yet before relief could bloom in Samuel's heart, the opposing counsel rose swiftly. The lead lawyer, a tall man named Vernon Hale, held up a sealed letter with a composure that oozed confidence. "Your Honor," he said, his tone smooth, "this evidence cannot be admitted. It has been deemed classified by the Federal Transport Authority. National interest prevents its disclosure." The words struck like a hammer against stone. The judge leaned forward, brows furrowed, as murmurs rolled through the gallery like thunder. Khalil gripped his brother's arm, whispering urgently, "They're trying to bury it again." Darius's face paled, but his jaw hardened. "They can't." Not this time. Their voices trembled with both fear and determination, the tension of youth standing against a wall of power. Samuel, however, did not flinch. He had expected some maneuver, though not this bold. Dramatic irony rippled through the air. The passengers in the gallery believed the case had been won, but Samuel knew the Empire's claws reached higher than most dared imagine. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, calling for order, but unease lingered in every corner of the room. "Mr. Hale," he said, adjusting his glasses, "are you stating that recordings presented to this court fall under federal classification?" "Yes, Your Honor," Hale replied, his voice carrying the confidence of a man backed by powerful hands. To admit them would compromise sensitive contracts tied to national transport security. A hush fell, suffocating and thick. Reporters exchanged alarmed glances, their pens hovering but hesitant to write. The jurors looked at one another, bewildered, caught between outrage and the weight of authority. Samuel's heart pounded steadily, but his mind was calm, calculating. He knew this move was coming from somewhere beyond Lionel or Hale. This was Eris Dominion's empire stretching its influence into the very government halls meant to serve justice. He rose slowly, every eye fixed on him, and addressed the judge with quiet resolve. "Your Honor, if the recordings cannot be heard in this room, they will be heard elsewhere. The truth cannot be bound by a stamp of secrecy when it is already free." Hale scoffed, lifting his chin. "Bold words, but without admissible evidence, your case collapses." Samuel's lips tightened into the faintest of smiles. He turned toward the large screen positioned for video exhibits. "Then let us hear from the man who risked everything to secure them." He gave a nod, and Marcus, his aide, activated the feed. The screen flickered. For a moment, the courtroom held its breath, uncertain if anything would appear. Then the image of Elias Ward filled the display, alive, though weary, his face lined with fear and determination. His voice, carried by static but unmistakably firm, broke the silence. "My name is Elias Ward. I was a scheduling officer for Eris Dominion. These recordings were taken by me, and before leaving the country, I delivered copies to multiple independent news outlets across the globe. Even if they are silenced here, they are already beyond reach." Gasps erupted, louder than before, echoing with disbelief and awe. Hale leapt to his feet, shouting objections, but his words were drowned by the uproar of the gallery. The judge struck his gavel with urgency, calling for silence, his face stern yet shaken. Samuel's gaze never left Elias. In that moment, he felt the weight of every step, every decision, every risk. The secrecy that Eris Dominion had built its fortress upon was now its own downfall. Dramatic irony snapped into sharp clarity. The attempt to hide the truth had instead illuminated it everywhere. The judge exhaled, leaning heavily against the bench. "Objection overruled. The evidence is admissible. Proceed." His words fell like a hammer, sealing the Empire's fate. Hale sat down stiffly, his face drained of color, while Lionel looked as though the very air had been stolen from his lungs. For hours, arguments raged, but the tide had shifted. The jurors listened with grave expressions, reviewing documents, recordings, and testimony, their deliberations stretching late into the evening. Outside, protesters chanted for justice, their voices carrying through the courthouse walls. Inside, Samuel clasped his son's hands, steadying them as the final weight dragged on. When at last the jury returned, the room hushed into silence. The foreman rose, a sheet of paper trembling slightly in his grasp. We, the jury, find Heiress Dominion guilty of systemic discrimination and fraud." The hall erupted. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, and tears welled in Khalil's and Darius's eyes. Samuel remained still, the verdict washing over him not as triumph but as vindication. His sons had endured humiliation, and now the world recognized their truth. He looked at them, his voice steady though thick with emotion. The lie that began at a gate had been broken by truth in a courtroom. The automatic doors hissed open as the Winter family stepped into Eastport International Airport. The same terminal, the same floors, the same ceiling lights humming overhead, but everything else had changed. New signs lined the walls, freshly mounted and gleaming under the spotlights. Zero tolerance for discrimination. Below them, uniformed staff stood straighter, wore polished smiles and pins on their lapels that read, "Respect in Service." Even the announcements sounded different, their tone firmer, as if the building itself had learned a lesson it could never unlearn. Samuel Winter walked at the front, tall and composed in a tailored navy suit, his briefcase swinging gently at his side. On either side of him were Khalil and Darius, their matching leather satchels now worn with pride rather than shame. Behind them trailed a handful of officials from the Department of Transportation's Oversight Committee, a quiet entourage that now followed Samuel as a matter of routine. No one stopped them. No one questioned the Braids. No one dared to glance twice. Khalil noticed it first. The check-in agents recognized them, their faces tight with nervous respect. One of them, a young man in a mint-green vest, quickly stepped aside to clear a path. The other whispered something into a walkie-talkie, eyes wide. Cameras flashed softly at a distance, some from press, others from passengers who remembered the story. "Feels like the floor's different," Darius murmured beside his father, his voice low. Samuel nodded slowly. "It is. Because now the ground knows whose feet walk on it." They reached the security lane, and this time the officers smiled and waved them through. No unnecessary searches, no sideways questions, no obstacles. The change was visible, but Samuel knew better than to trust only what eyes could see. The reforms had come at a price. Heiress Dominion had been forced to dismantle its policies. Their coded language, their hidden quotas, their unwritten rules were dragged into the light. The lawsuits had drained them. The board had been reshuffled. And the Oversight Committee, his Oversight Committee, now sat above them all. Yet, for all the victories, shadows lingered. Elias Ward was still missing. His apartment had been emptied under cover of night. His last known message had come from a burner account traced to a server in Prague. Samuel had tried to protect him, but some forces moved too quickly. He hadn't given up, but the silence was chilling. Leonard Voss, the executive who turned witness, had survived an arson attempt. He now lived under federal protection, unable to see his children without coordination. His sacrifice had given the case its spine, but it had also cost him everything. And Victor Hearn, he had simply vanished. No trail, no records, not even a whisper. Samuel had reason to believe that Heiress Dominion had buried the truth about Victor deeper than any grave. Still, they walked forward. Up ahead, the gate was visible. Gate 14, the very place it had all started. And standing there now, in a sharp gray uniform, was a new attendant. His name tag read Nathaniel. He straightened the moment he saw them. "Mr. Winter," he said, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed a slight tremble. "It's an honor, sir. Boarding has been pre-cleared. You and your sons are welcome any time." Samuel paused, not out of hesitation, but acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said. "And remember, it's not just about us. It's about everyone after us." "Yes, sir," Nathaniel replied, standing a little taller. They walked down the jet bridge in silence, the hum of the plane waiting like a heartbeat at the end of a long corridor. As they entered the cabin, heads turned, not in suspicion this time, but in recognition. Passengers watched with quiet reverence, some offering small nods, others gently applauding. A flight attendant stepped aside, offering a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Winter. Welcome, young men." Khalil and Darius exchanged a glance, relief, pride, and something else they didn't yet have words for. They moved toward their seats, first-class cabins polished and waiting. No whispers, no rejection, no gatekeeper saying no. They sat down together, placing their satchels in the overhead bins. The leather had aged, but so had they. Stronger, sharper, respected. As the cabin doors began to close, Samuel leaned back in his seat and exhaled. Across from him, Darius looked out the window. "Do you think it's really over?" Samuel's eyes stayed on his son's. "No. Power always finds new disguises, but when the world tests you again, you'll know how to stand." Khalil smiled. "We learned from the best." The plane's engine rumbled beneath them. The captain's voice echoed overhead with practiced ease, and as the aircraft pulled away from the gate, rising toward a new sky, Samuel turned to his sons once more. "You stood tall when the world tried to bend you." The twins smiled, braids still worn proudly, no longer symbols of exclusion, but of resilience. As they finally boarded a first-class flight without obstruction, the cabin grew quiet with respect. From humiliation to triumph, their journey had proven that no seat was too high for them to claim. Moments later, the phone call changed everything. Their father was the president's right hand, and the entire terminal froze. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, discrimination, and the arrogance of unchecked prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic bias, provoke thought about accountability in public-facing roles, and inspire action toward dignity, justice, and equality.